Welcome to our Week 32 writing lesson. Last week we wrote the beginnings of our September 11th historical fiction story. And this week we are focused on writing the middle, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. So what do you need to do? First, go through the slides on this presentation to learn some tips about how to write a good middle for your historical fiction story, and how to use the tools that we already have. Remember, we're not starting from scratch. On Tuesday, you're going to write Chapter 3 of your historical fiction story. And on Wednesday, you'll write Chapter 4. Which part of the story is the middle? In our stories, the middle of the story will be 2 chapters. You should have at least one new problem in each chapter, because we know in the rising action, the things get worse and worse for the main character who is struggling to get what they want. This is just a slide to help you remember what's the beginning, middle, and the end of a story and the parts that they generally have. The middle of the story includes the rising action, where the problem keeps getting worse, the climax, where the problem gets the worst it could possibly be, and this sort of success or failure test. Sometimes the main character tries to do something, and we either see if it goes well or it goes poorly. So these scenes should show the character's complexity and develop the heart of the story. Now, let's gather all the tools we already have to start writing the middle. Now, our pre-writing can still help us in the middle. We've got a story arc, we learned about historical context, we developed our characters, we wrote a scene with dialogue, and we established the heart of the story. But now we have an additional tool. Chapter 1 and 2, we've already written our beginning. So let's start with how to use the story arc to help us. Now, we've made 6 different points on this story arc. I'm going to take the point from problem gets worse and make that chapter 3. And I'll take that from the point from climax and make that chapter 4. Now, I don't have to start from scratch. I've already got clear ideas about what I want to do from my story arc. So I just copied and pasted those parts there to begin chapter 3. Now I have my historical context, and I can remember once again just the time difference between the 2 flights hitting the towers and little things like that. So because I have the flight hitting the tower in chapter 4, I'm realizing that there should only be about 15 minutes between what happened in chapter 2 and what happened in chapter 4. That means that I'm really going to have to slow down and tell the story from within it so it doesn't seem like too much time is passing. So I can double check what happened in history. Now to chapter 3, I'm going to add the fact that we know that there were almost no survivors from stairs B and C. So it's really important that Brian goes down stair A, which is what happened in real life. In chapter 4, I'm going to remember that it was actually the South Tower that was attacked second. So I'm correcting that mistake, and I'm adding that that happened at 9:03 a.m. just so I can remember once again that 15-minute time difference. Now, I've gone back to Brian, my character, and I wanted to remember that this time I want to bring out the fact that he's 54 years old. I want to think about what happens as someone who has lived a substantial part of their life goes through a kind of near-death experience. So I want to show more of Brian using flashbacks from his life. I want the reader to get to know Stanley as well through his actions. So the middle is actually a really cool moment to introduce a new character, as long as you've already built up your main character. It's really important to establish the main character first, but then if you want to add another character, you can do that in the middle. So in chapter 3, I'm going to show more about Brian's life by reminding the reader, telling the reader that he's 54 years old, that he's lived a long life. And while he's panicking, I want him to remember scenes from his past so I can show a little bit more of his backstory. And in chapter 4, since there's going to be 2 characters, I want to show what's happening with each character using narration. Now, I can go back to this scene that I wrote in the past, but I remember that this scene, I decided it should go when the problem solving begins. So that's actually going to be in chapter 5, and that's not the chapter we're writing right now. So since the scene that I already wrote doesn't belong in the middle, I'm just going to think critically about how Brian talks in these scenes and how I add dialogue in these scenes. So in chapter 3, I know that I want the new problem to be that someone's hurt. So I'm thinking that even before we know who Stanley is, we can hear him whimper, "Help me, I need someone." And that can be like the most important dialogue from that chapter. In chapter 4, I do want the guys to introduce themselves, but this is not just a normal day. It shouldn't sound like they're coming into Starbucks like, "Hi, how are you? Good morning. What's happening?" So I want to cut the greetings and make really quick dialogue that lets us know it's an emergency, but at the same time, we need the characters to know each other's names. Next, I'm using the heart of my story. Remember that what my story is really about, the lesson that we're really teaching here, is that life is richer with family, that it takes energy to build a family, but it's worth it. So I need to think about how Stanley can connect to the idea of family throughout these 2 chapters so that it makes sense that that's what he's learning from this experience. So I thought a way to add that could be changing the dialogue a little bit in chapter 3. Maybe instead of "I need someone," "I need you." And that could make Stanley feel like he's really being called out. I wondered if we could add into his memory the character of Cynthia, his wife. I just made up that name. And mention that she needs Brian and kind of have Brian realize that he needs to feel needed. Okay. Now, in the bold part in chapter 4, I decided that maybe Brian and Stanley are getting close quickly. Remember that scene with dialogue that I created? They actually call each other brothers. So I need to start setting up the fact that they're going to get quite close so it doesn't feel like whiplash, so it doesn't feel like, wait, where did that come from? They barely know each other. I want to show that they're getting close in an emergency situation. So I want to show first that they're physically close and physically reliant on each other. And then later, I want to show that there's also something going on in the feelings. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that yet, but I'm just kind of planting ideas. In each of these slides, I'm adding the new thought in bold. This is all developing, so it's okay to have a decision and then change your mind about what you want. You're the writer, you're the author. We're coming up with what this story is going to look like. So I think the most important thing as you're looking through all the things you've already done is to really think about one way that you can apply some of the richness you've already created. And then later you can step back and look at all of it before you start writing. Now, this is pretty exciting. We have another tool, my chapter 1 and my chapter 2. Now, if you didn't hear this, go back to the last video and you can hear me read it aloud. So I remembered that in the first chapter, Brian ignored a call from his dad. Maybe he could connect to his father through his thoughts in this scene. Obviously, his father is not in the tower. His father didn't come to work with him, but we always carry those we love in our hearts, and maybe there's something about that that's connecting Brian to these scenes. So I imagine that in chapter 3, maybe one of the flashbacks is from his wedding, and he's remembering his vows, and he's remembering how proud his father was of him on that day when he got married. Or maybe in chapter 4, he's reminded of one of his dad's sayings. Our dads always say things like, "Money doesn't grow on trees," or things like that. So maybe he has a saying and he remembers the fact that he ignored the call. So now that I've gone back to all 6 of my tools, I've really taken a moment to sit with each of them and see what it is that I can take from that. Now I'm going to think about what makes a good middle. We need to see that rising conflict for the main character until the climax. It's got to get worse and worse. No solutions yet. I thought about using the tool of flashback, where in one moment we see some scenes from the past. I also thought about using the tool of simultaneous action. We see something happening and something else happening at the exact same time. And we need to use transition words to help the reader understand what's going on with simultaneous action. And finally, I thought about the idea of introducing a new character. In this middle, we're going to meet Stanley, and I'm hoping that that's going to make my story even more interesting. So let's remember, what do you need to do? Go through these slides in your own time. Try to see how I made connections between the things I had already written and the things I was going to write. I went step by step, so it wasn't so overwhelming. I didn't just start with a blank paper and think, how am I going to begin? Right? I used everything that we'd been working on. So I want you to go through these slides and understand that. And then on Tuesday, write chapter 3, and on Wednesday, write chapter 4. Now, on the next slides, you'll see the mentor text, and I'm going to take just a moment to read those to you in this video. Chapter 3, What He Needed. The doorway to Stair A was jam-packed with people desperately trying to squeeze through. Brian wondered for an instant if there was any way to bring order, but he knew he had no choice. He wiggled his way through the heap of arms, legs, and torsos and made it into the stairwell. The air around him was warm with body heat, and his ears hurt from the echoes of footsteps pounding down flight after flight. He was overwhelmed with sound until he heard a whimper. "Help me! I need you!" It was coming from the next landing. Brian heard these words as if they were directed at him. Crumpled in a heap, Brian found a man bleeding from his leg who had not been able to continue down the stairs. Brian kneeled down, protecting the man from the others with his body. He must have asked the man where it hurt because he quickly loosened his tie and fashioned a tourniquet around the stranger's upper thigh. All the while, Brian's mind only saw images of his 54 years long life so far. He saw a flash of himself on the ground as his father wrapped his sprained wrist after a Boy Scouts adventure. That must have been when he was about 9. The memory changed to the moment he left home for college, his car full of bags and both of his parents smiling, though a tear rolled down his mother's cheek. Finally, his memory flashed to the moment he slid the ring onto Cynthia's finger and made her his wife 25 beautiful years ago. Warmth spread over his heart when he remembered their vows to be what each other needed. He recalled the pride in his father's face when he saw that commitment. Now Brian realized this man needed him, and he needed to get out. So that's chapter 3. Let's read chapter 4, and then we'll look at our last slide. Chapter 4, Inseparable. Brian helped the man up and pulled his arm around his shoulder. "The name's Brian," he mentioned efficiently. "You can lean on me." "I'm Stanley," the stranger said, wincing in pain but full of gratitude. Stanley hopped down each step, sharing the weight with Brian. As he felt Brian's supportive arm around his waist, he swallowed a cry. Stanley mumbled to himself, "I thought I was a goner." "Nope," Brian interrupted. "I need to get out. We need to get out. Here, hold on to me." Brian picked up the pace as close to a run as they could. He had lost count of how many flights they had descended when a crash came from above. They felt vibrations. Some dirt fell from the ceiling and they heard people scream around them. The vibration reminded him of the call that he had ignored this morning. It was from his dad. Would he get to see him again? Determined to shake off his fear, Brian chuckled. "My dad always said, a little dirt never hurt." Stanley grinned. They grunted and pushed off the next step together in rhythm. As sweat poured down their bodies, they just held each other tighter and kept going down, step by step, in sync, inseparable. Now, I want you to take all you know and write the best middle you can.